So you have lived in different parts of the United States, and your first journey was overseas when you went to Austria. Tell us about that.
So in college, I went to Salzburg, Austria to study German, and that was only 2 months, but it gave me a flavor for and a longing for more travel. I had a Eurail pass and went all over Europe. I was probably in more than a dozen countries. After that, after graduate school, I went to the UK and studied in London at the London School of Economics. And that just made me long even more for living overseas because that lasted about a year and a half. And it was like a tip of the iceberg.
And at what point did you meet your husband, who is a physician?
So when I went back to the US from London, I actually went back and forth to London about 6 times trying to find a way to live there. And it never worked out. I did go back for a PhD to the University of London and decided that wasn't for me.
Sorry, I'm just curious. Why wasn't the PhD for you?
I got my master's degree over there and loved living in London and loved doing the work for that degree. The PhD was going to be a lot longer process. I had unstable housing. It was hard to make a living over there and go to school. But I knew I could do that in the US because I had been a journalist and I had worked for Jack Anderson, the syndicated investigative reporter. So I knew I could get a job again in the US. And while I was looking for a job, I met my husband.
Got it. Okay. And then, and he started getting some job offers in Africa first. That was his first overseas assignment or not?
Not quite that early. He was a resident, so he was finishing his residency. And he wanted to go back to Africa because he was actually born there. So his father was a public health veterinarian, and he lived in Belgian Congo for 13 years. And during that time, my husband was born, and so were his brothers. And so he had a real love for Africa already.
It
He
was just
grew up,
built into his DNA
oh,
practically.
it's part of his DNA. In fact, whenever he meets, anybody from Congo in the US, they all call him mon frère, because
My brother.
so yeah. So anyway, when we were dating, was at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health for his MPH, Master's in Public Health. And I knew he wanted to go overseas. I just didn't know it was going to be as uh, a young mother because we then got married, had kids, and as a young mother, he asked me to go to Ivory Coast, and this was in the 1990s, early 90s, when AIDS was at its worst in Africa. And so taking two small children there with malaria and AIDS as the leading causes of death was a real stretch.
The only good news is that Cote d'Ivoire, at least because it's in West Africa, was not nearly as bad as it was in Southern Africa, where the HIV had up to 25% of the populations in places like Swaziland. And, it was very high. But still, it didn't help that it was, as you said, no retrovirals, no kind of ways to combat. HIV was just a death sentence back then.
Right. And, in early 90s, we didn't even know for sure how it was transmitted, the HIV virus. So, yeah, you would worry about a scratch or things like that. By the end of our time there, we were in Ivory Coast for 6 years. And by the end of the time, it was so well understood that it really was hard to transmit. You wouldn't get it from just a scratch.
Right.
And so by the end of our time there, I was a real nervous mother in the beginning. By the end, we had a cook who he was a part-time cook at our house, and he developed AIDS and wanted to keep working because he had a family of seven to support. And we had no problem allowing somebody with HIV in our kitchen cooking for our family because we knew, it's very hard to transmit.
That's
And
true.
yeah.
In fact, it's so hard nowadays. I mean, I think that you have to have sex many times, like hundreds of times, finally, for it to transmit.
No, that's not, you could get it from a first time, if women can get it more easily than men,
Right.
as from what I understand, and if you have it all depends on your health,
Mm.
so anyway, you don't want to take a chance,
Right.
but but there are lots of good modes now for not getting it. There's a prep pill that people can take if they're in a high um
A prep pill?
yes, it's called PrEP. That's the
Mm.
the name of the pill you can take if you're in a highly vulnerable group, say
Wow.
sex workers. So they can
Okay.
take this pill, and it really does diminish the chances of you
I had no
affecting.
idea about that. That's fascinating. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's go back to some of the hardest lessons, the ones that took you a while to learn when you got there. Because I remember, I was reading in your book, Circling Home, you get there at the airport at Cote d'Ivoire, all of a sudden you get hit like a furnace, the heat, the humidity, and all that kind of stuff. But what eventually took you maybe months to get used to or to learn?
Two big factors, I think, kind of colored my enjoyment of the first year in Ivory Coast. One was the fear factor. The we were told that there were all these burglaries, home invasions,
Mm.
carjackings. It was kind of a high crime city.
It's kind of like South Africa has the same kind of image even today.
Yes, yes, but it was less warranted in Abidjan.
Right.
And so I was full of fear driving to the grocery store,
Mm.
encountering people on the street. You just were very, I was very guarded at first. And by the end of our time there, after just a couple of years, I would pull up to an intersection where a lot of people with, polio survivors and other people were panhandling. And I knew them by name, and we would chat. And so I wasn't so full of fear. You learn how to connect with people.
Right.
So
Right.
that's a big thing. The other big factor is it really does take a while for your system to adjust in new countries, but especially in African countries. And so Westerners have to be very careful about drinking the water, washing vegetables, fresh vegetables like lettuce and spinach and that kind of thing in a sort of bleach and water bath to kill microorganisms because I came down with all kinds of things when I
Did
that
your
first.
kids adjust better than you?
No, they had things too, but they just didn't know how to voice, their complaints as well as
Okay.
I did.
Okay.
So
Now
they didn't come.
you were also in Kenya, correct?
Tanzania.
Oh, Tanzania. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And one other country. In, I know you went to Switzerland too, but just
Right.
focusing on Africa.
Those two countries are the countries we lived in.
Mhm.
We traveled in every African country like you. We were
Mhm.
everywhere, got all over the place, and spent more time in, um, I'd say, West Africa, going to Benin, Togo, Nigeria, Senegal. My husband has worked more recently in Southern Africa. So he has projects in Zimbabwe, Mozambique. He was in South Africa for a long time. So he's back and forth to Zimbabwe quite often, but I never lived there.
Got it. What about the pros and cons of raising children in either Africa or in any kind of place that's quite different than the United States?
Well, the greatest pro is to open them up to other languages because we don't learn languages as children in the US other than English. And um, I studied French and Spanish in high school and college, and it's just nothing like being in a country and living there. So our kids are fluent in French. They're very versatile. They're resilient when they move to another country or travel. They know how to talk to people. They're not afraid. They're not afraid of, encountering people from other cultures. In fact, our daughter ended up living in London. So she's in London with a British partner and has two children.
How funny. So she completed your dream.
She did. Very good. Yeah, yeah, she did.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what about the cons of raising children abroad?
Can I give you a couple more pros?
Sure. Go for it.
Um, the One of the great things for kids is the amazing community service opportunities they have for like when they're in international schools. and the excursions they can take. So, like, my son was tutoring kids in a local public school in Dar es Salaam in Abidjan, in Tanzania, for his community service. And my daughter was reading to children in a cancer hospital. And so they saw so much. I mean, they will never unsee some of the images they saw with, the poverty and the illness and that kind of thing, the suffering. But then for excursions, they would go off for fall break and for spring break. Like my son climbed Kilimanjaro with his classmates on a spring break. And my daughter learned to dive in Zanzibar. So they just have an amazing array of opportunities for encountering other cultures, which I think is why you're there.
I see that your children are fulfilling your dreams because I know you tried to get up Kilimanjaro, but you came just short. And you tried to live in London and you came just short. And your
There you
daughter and your
go.
son are just completing all your dreams. They're checking
Bingo.
off those boxes.
I guess I have more to be grateful for. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
But what about the cons? Come on.
Well, the cons, I think that it's harder for them to get a sense of home when they're young. They kind of they identify home with their parents. So I had to be very astute about finding my sense of home as soon as I got to a country, just so and making home for them. But then when we, left, so we left Abidjan, Ivory Coast, when my son was 9 and my daughter was 6. And those are very, 9 is a very vulnerable age for kids to return to the US. It was so hard. My son still, to this day, is in his 30s now, calls it the hardest year of his life. And it's because he went to a school in Atlanta that was a great school, but there weren't many kids who had lived overseas, and particularly in Africa. So, there was a little bit of bullying. People called him Africa boy. And, he didn't know he didn't know the games American kids played. He didn't know the music they listened to, the shows they watched. So it really took him a year to get his feet on the ground, much more so than me. I landed in Atlanta and had immediate connections. I made friends and started a writing group. And so for kids, it's hard. It's hard to be displaced several times throughout their youth.
Somebody's listening to this, Terry, and they're saying, gosh, I want to live like Terry. I want to be able to live abroad. What tips would you give them?
So I would say uh, just get the fear factor behind you and say, okay, I'm not going to give into that, and learn as much as you can before you go about the culture. This is what I did when I went to Tanzania. In Ivory Coast, I started off the first year afraid. In Tanzania, I hit the ground running. I learned as much as I could about, Maasai and Swahili language. And I just wanted to join everything when I got there. So I jumped in with both feet, found volunteer opportunities. I was teaching English to children in a local public school. I became chair of the Corona Women's Society. Sounds like a beer club, but it's actually a worldwide women's society.
Actually, it sounds like you guys actually engineered the coronavirus. That's what it sounds like. The
Oh my
Corona
goodness, I
Society.
never made that connection. Yeah, there you go.
I know you're patient zero.
Yeah, no, 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 don't do that.
It's forget the Wuhan lab. It's your lab, Terry.
Yeah,
Your
no, I don't
Corona
think.
lab. Your Corona club.
Well, we'll be open for investigation now, thanks to you.
Exactly.
But another tip I would say is just give yourself plenty of time and find ways to de-stress and just not rush. So you're going to be lonely for a couple of weeks or months. So you're going to be sick a little bit. I'm not making it sound great, but find ways to de-stress. For me, it was yoga and meditation, and it just helped a lot to get refocused, recentered, and then go out and try to, talk to people outside your gate. It was a much richer experience after connecting with people and learning the guy's name who guarded the house next door and talking to him and, knowing that he was watching out for my kids and for us.
Right. What about any kind of regrets that you have?
Um, in tandem with the tips, I would say one of the biggest regrets is that I did let fear kind of influence some
How
of
many
my.
months?
Did it take? In Ivory Coast, it took me about, I'd say, 5 months
Hmm.
before I made some of my best friends there. I'm still in touch and they still come and visit, friends from that time. That's 30 years ago. And so it was only after I made close friendships that I kind of looked to other women who knew the culture, knew how to navigate things much better than I did. And so I kind of attached myself to these people that were real aficionados in and totally comfortable living in the cultures there. So other regret that I didn't stay longer in Tanzania and go to Mozambique because I understand from other CDC families, that Centers for Disease Control, that's who we were overseas with, that Mozambique is just amazing. People love living there. And we loved living in Tanzania. I wish we had stayed more than 3 years.
Right. It is. I've spent about a year in Tanzania or so,
Oh,
so I know what you're saying. What about what surprised you about Africa, and specifically, whether it be, for example, you were in Cote d'Ivoire, you felt yourself like I'm an expert at Africa by now. By the time you went to Tanzania, and then all of a sudden, boom, something that was surprising that hit you, or maybe it was one of your trips to Sudan or to wherever, to Kigali, wherever, that all of a sudden something else about the continent that just surprised you. Because I'm trying to write the unseen Africa. These are parts of Africa that we just don't think about or see. So, what would you say to
right.
that?
First of all, how diverse it is. I mean, it's like saying what do you think about North America? I mean, it's just there's so many different countries, and even within countries, there's so much diversity. So in Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, the north is a Sahel country. It's like very
Desert.
dry. Yeah, yeah, whereas the South is a tropical rainforest. And you have very different people. In fact, there was a civil war because they're such different people. The people from the North tend to be Muslims, people from the South tend to be Christians. So there was all that diversity. Culturally, it's so different. I mean, even within Ivory Coast, there are like 60 different languages and cultures. But from East to West Africa, in East Africa, in Tanzania, totally different landscapes, different people, very mellow kind of Swahili culture is just so different from the cultures we encountered in Ivory Coast. So it was surprising to learn about those differences. But what kind of really surprised me as well is how open and interested people were in us when we showed an interest in them. That was true anywhere, didn't matter where we traveled. I have a story in my book about going to Senegal. We were just there for a week. That's all. And we hired a taxi driver to take us to a beach town about an hour and a half outside of Dakar. And on the way, we saw all these goats on the road and couldn't understand why the car was, bumper to bumper because of these goats. And the taxi driver told us it was Tabaski. And so all these goats were going to be slaughtered soon. And he said, as a matter of fact, my family is going to be celebrating this afternoon. Would you like to come? And so we went and had the most amazing experience. My son, who I mentioned had a very difficult year moving back here at age 9, remembers that as a highlight of our years in Ivory Coast because he could run around with the village kids and with our hosts' children, speaking French, playing with them. People just, were so kind and open when we showed an interest in them and asked questions.
Yeah, it's so true. By the way, when you talked about Tabaski, which is a Muslim festival, annual festival, where they do slaughter the goat. I happened to be in Burkina Faso, and I spent about a month in Burkina Faso when that festival was going on, and everything seemed like wonderful all over the country. And then, like a couple months after I left, it erupted into like some sort of civil war, effectively. And so my question to
Yes.
you was, you were in Cote d'Ivoire in the 1990s, and just a
Yeah.
couple of years after you left, suddenly a civil war erupted. That was pretty serious in Cote d'Ivoire. I didn't see the Burkina Faso, even though I was there months before. I didn't see, didn't feel tensions or anything like that. It just caught me out of the blue. I felt like such an idiot. It's like, I think I'm kind of immersed in this culture, and I'm obviously missing some subtleties because this civil war erupted. I didn't see it coming. Did the same thing happen to you in Cote d'Ivoire, or did you see their civil war brewing even while you were there?
No, we didn't see it. And it really was only a couple months after we left, because we left in July of 99 and the Civil War started in December, the first coup. And frankly, I think a lot of these conflicts, and we knew many people from Burkina Faso, they are such gentle, wonderful people. And I just feel like these conflicts start at the top. It's generals and people, trying to grab power, and then they get as many followers as they can. So, no, we didn't see it coming, even though we did sort of live in a state of tension while we were in Ivory Coast, because whenever there was a national election, they thought that something could happen. And so the embassy would tell us, be prepared for evacuation around the upcoming elections. And so we had to have bags packed and be ready for that. But it is really sad. Ivory Coast descended into civil war for about 10 years. And again, I just can't help feeling that most of that comes from the top. And it's not people that want to, that hate each other.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It also is telling, because I came at the end of the Civil War. I came in 2013 or so when I first came to Ivory Coast, and to me, it was still a little bit of the remnants. At that point, they were already rebuilding, and things are much better
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder about our own country, or any country for that matter. If like we're oblivious, living amongst them, and we don't see it coming, could all of a sudden civil war erupt in the United States from 1 month to the next or 1 year to the next? It's remarkable how these things happen. Now, your book, Circling Home, who did you write it for?
Friends and other people who, it's just a small window I was offering on a world that you won't see otherwise. You don't get the picture of, the faces behind the statistics about how many people are dying of AIDS, you
Mm.
know, how many people live in poverty, how many people, are suffering in the rest of the world. And so this kind of is a way to put names and faces on some of the rest of the world that we hear about, but don't really have an insider view. Like you're
Eh,
trying to offer an insider view of Africa too.
Yeah, failing miserably. But in your case, you can also show the other side as well, which is that you hear all the headline news, which is usually bad news, and then at the same time you can see some of the joy, the friendliness, and just the camaraderie, and the
Absolutely.
beauty, and that there is actually a large amount of peace in Africa. Like 99% of the continent is actually at peace. There's only a
Right.
tiny portion. So they're dealing with the poverty. It does exist. There are diseases that are really burdensome. But at the same time, there's that flip side of things, which you obviously lived and you wrote about in Circling Home, which is, hey, life goes on and things are pretty good in many other respects as well. And
And
don't be
people don't
afraid.
live, yeah, and most people don't live in huts, and there aren't
Right.
lions and elephants prowling around in your backyard. I mean, it's as modern as the US in many ways. Most cities in Africa.
Yes, and that's the key point, cities, because once you go to the villages, then all of a sudden, sometimes the electricity may no longer be there, or if it is, it's intermittent and things like that. Some modern plumbing may go out and you're going to an outhouse. But
But they
certain,
still have cell phones.
yes, you're absolutely right.
Everybody has cell
That's
phones.
right. There are more cell phones than people in Africa, that's for sure. Um, anyway, Terry, thank you so much for coming on the WanderLearn show. Tell everybody how they can find out more about your book, because there are several circling home books out there. So how can they find yours?
This is the only one that says what I learned by living elsewhere, and it's the only one by Terry Repak, and you can get it on bookshop.org or Amazon, or best just at your local bookstore. Support your local bookstore. Best
Very
way to
good.
do things.
Excellent. And is there a online? Do you have either a website or place
I
that
do
you
have a
would?
website with
Mhm.
lots of articles sort of that spun off from the book. In fact, I have an article in the Seattle Times coming out next week.
Great.
It's just my name, terryrepak.com.
Wonderful. Terry, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much and best of luck with your book.
Thank you, Francis.